Assalamu alaikum. 1258, a very significant date in the history of Islam and the Muslim world. It marks the fall of Baghdad under Mongol invading forces, and the Muslim world has never been the same ever since the fall of Baghdad, especially for Middle East, in the Arab world. In that medieval time, it caused a major shift in the geopolitics of the day, economics, intellectual aspects. So I want to talk about all of this. Before we get to the actual siege, why is Baghdad so important? How did it come to be the capital, the biggest city in the Muslim world? Let's have a look at that first. The Baghdad was established in 762 by Abbasids. Abbasids at the time came to power in 750 when they toppled the Umayyad Empire. So if we go back just briefly, this caliph or caliphate, it was the political system in the Muslim world that emerged after Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So when the Prophet passed away, the successors were called the caliphs, and caliphs stayed in a capital. So initially, there were three major capitals until we come to the Baghdad. Well, Baghdad is the third major capital. The first one is Medina. So Medina was the city of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and that became the capital for 30 years during the four rightly guided caliphs. So when Muawiyah became the caliph and therefore established the Umayyad line of caliphs, which is called the Umayyad Empire, it became no longer a government of the companions or legitimate, rightly guided caliphs, but it became a dynastic rule. That's a different story in itself. But when Umayyads took over the caliphate, they moved the capital to Damascus. So Damascus was where Muawiyah became strong. He was the governor of Syria, and he took the capital to Damascus. But one of the issues with Damascus was that it was already an established city. It had a long history, and it was a Roman or Byzantine city. So Muslims settled there and turned it into an Islamic city. But it wasn't really truly Islamic in that sense. So Abbasid wanted to change that. When they took power by toppling Umayyads, they wanted to establish a city of their own. And for this, they chose the location of Baghdad, which is next to Tigris River, in 762. And the reason for choosing that location was it was more central to the Muslim world. Now Muslim world spanned all the way from Spain, Andalus, North Africa, Middle East, Iran, Central Asia, and even Western India up to Indus River. So this was a vast world. In order to govern this, they needed a more central location. So Baghdad was perfect, or that location in Iraq, modern-day Iraq, next to Tigris River. It ensured that main travel routes, economic routes, could intersect in that location. So they have built Baghdad in 762. And the way the city was built is a really good example of an Islamic architectural vision, or how they did urban planning. So it was a round city. It was built in the center was the palace of the caliph and a big mosque. And then around it, so that became the central hub of the city, much like Canberra in Australia, or modern day conceptualization of capital cities. So Muslims did that early on. And then they had military quarters, the markets around that, and then the residential quarters would spread across the city in that way. So quickly, Baghdad became sprawled into a large geography and became the biggest city in the world. And it surpassed, the historians say that it surpassed 1 million population. And it was the second city in history to ever to do so after Rome. So being the capital and the major urban city in the Muslim world, Baghdad had held political power, It was a seat of caliphate. The army was stationed there, and it became an economic power by virtue of the city being a huge source of consumption, and everything from east and the west flowed into the city. And as a result of that perhaps surplus or production of urbanization, Muslims could fund intellectual activity. So a lot of scientific work, scholarly work happened in Baghdad. The Nizamiya madrasas were established in Baghdad. Imam Ghazali came and rose to prominence in Baghdad. So whatever you want to, if you wanted to rise in the Muslim world, that was a city to go and city to be. So Baghdad became a central intellectual and civilizational center of the Muslim world. We know this because the 1001 Arabian Nights stories, they all occur in Baghdad. Harun al-Rashid, these legendary caliphs, also rose in the city of Baghdad. And one of the key institutions in the city was the House of Wisdom, or Darul Hikmah, that was established firstly as a palace library where the caliph and the entourage, they collected these books from around the world in every language, and then they were started to have a translation movement. So this library became an institution of learning, higher learning, and more importantly became an archetype of what a library could be. And quickly, many other, up to 50 libraries were established in the city. And you can imagine that each library would have hundreds and thousands of books, and the number of books in Baghdad alone surpassed the entire books in the rest of the world in a way. In Europe at the time, a library had 1,000 books the most, and these were usually the abbeys or monasteries. There was no intellectual institutions that housed that many books. And you add to that the bookmakers or scribes. Imagine you would have a shop where somebody would come in and say, I want to buy that book. And then the person would say, come back 2 weeks later, and a scribe would write it, bind it, and he would get a book of his own. So basically, intellectually, it was also the center of the Muslim world. And from there, Islamic civilization grew. So Abbasids were civilizational makers. They were not conquerors like the Umayyads. Yes, they did fight wars and they did try to conquer places, but not at the speed, or it wasn't the only thing they wanted to do. They built this shining golden age of Islamic civilization, and Baghdad was the place where it all happened. So how did all of that change to lead us to 1258, when Baghdad was fell to the Mongol invading forces? I'm going to talk about three main reasons, three main factors that resulted that. And then we'll talk about the actual siege itself, how it happened briefly, and then I'll talk about the implications of the fall of Baghdad for Muslim civilization and Muslim history. And you could even say the world history in that respect. Well, there were three main reasons why Baghdad could fall. The first one is the decline of the caliphate itself. Now, when we look at the Umayyads, which ruled for 90 years, they had a central government, and they had governors appointed by the caliph to rule over certain territories. This model worked with Abbasids as well. They did exactly the same thing. So Abbasids controlled the entire Muslim world, with the exception of Spain, Andalus. Andalus was controlled at the time by a descendant of Umayyads, Abdul Rahman. So it was rather independent of the Abbasid government. But elsewhere, the governors, Abbasid governors, were ruling, and they were controlled by the caliph himself. So the caliph was the head of state. They had big armies, and they controlled the entire Muslim world. But this changed after about 200 years of Abbasid rule in the middle of 10th century, when the caliphs could no longer hold large armies, and there are different reasons for that, but that weakened the Caliph himself. So the Caliph could no longer contain the Muslim world. The Muslim world was too large. There was just too many ambitious people, local rulers or families, let's say, or dynasties who wanted to rule. They didn't want to be governed by governors. They wanted to control their own destiny, I guess, the local people at the time. So that really weakened the Abbasid Caliphate itself. It lost its military power, let's say. It lost its economic power, but it retained the political power, legitimacy. So even though the caliphs couldn't control these territories, still if someone took over, let's say North Africa, they engaged with the caliph, and the caliph kind of recognized them. They sent gifts, envoys to the caliph, and then the caliph gave them a flag and a document saying that the caliph recognized the leadership, their rule. So basically, political legitimacy in the Muslim world required the caliph to endorse anyone who took over, and caliph basically automatically signed these things because the caliph liked that being the disposer of that political legitimacy. So it really worked out well for the caliph. It worked out for all these local rulers. In terms of religious legitimacy or influence, the caliphs traditionally did not have religious influence in the Muslim world. Even right from this, I guess, after the rightly guided caliph era, they were just rulers. In a sense, still not like kings, but they did not have religious representation. Religious representation were transferred to the scholars. And that's a key shift in the Muslim world. But what we see after this 10th century, when the caliph loses their political control, he starts to claim more religious legitimacy, or wants to influence religious developments or interpretations. And we see this in these rather interesting demonstrations or reading of aqidah, or list of beliefs or creeds, let's say, that are correct, and every Muslim should follow these. These were, at some regular intervals, were read in biggest mosque in Baghdad, presided over by the caliph, to declare what is the right thing to believe, the right creed to follow. And that was really an interesting period, and caliphs were involved in that. So the decline of the caliphate obviously weakened Baghdad. So that was one factor. The second factor is the political fragmentation of the Muslim world. So as soon as the caliphs did not have political control or military control, let's say, the local rulers, everything was up for grabs, basically. And the entire regions of the Muslim world fragmented into smaller bits. And then one of those, let's say a city ruler, would get stronger and have some allies, and then they would take over large territories and establish bigger empires. And one of them is the Seljuk, for example, Turks first came to sort of a Middle East in 11th century, and then the Tuğrul Bey was recognized by the Caliph as the Sultan, and then Tuğrul Bey and Seljuk Turks started to take over much of the Muslim world, the Khorasan, the modern-day Iran, Syria, Middle East, elsewhere as well. So they established a huge, big empire and a bit of a central government under the tutelage of the Abbasid Caliphs. And Seljuk Turks were really important in legitimizing, also supporting Sunni Islam. They were the ones who really backed up or came up with the Nizamiya madrasas with Nizam al-Mulk. That's another story we could look into in a future video. So the political fragmentation was such that when the Crusaders came into the Middle East in 1099. They came all the way to Jerusalem. They had 12,000 soldiers, and they were able to take the city from Muslims. 12,000 soldiers. And the Muslim world was that weak, disorganized. I guess local rulers, everyone basically fending for themselves. And what happens is that after that fall, several decades later, Nuruddin comes. Nuruddin is a Syrian, or he was a Turkish ruler in Syria. He tried to unify Syria against the Crusaders. He became successful in terms of uniting Syria. At least it took him 20 years. And then Saladin comes, and Saladin is able to unite Egypt and Syria and to launch a campaign against Crusaders. And eventually he gets Jerusalem back in 1187. But that even itself reveals how weak the Abbasid Caliphate was in Baghdad and how fragmented the Muslim world was. It's very interesting that in that process, for example, Saladin is doing a lot of propaganda as well to unite people, to rally people around himself and his cause. And he gets in correspondence with the Abbasid Caliph, sends letters, updates, informs the Caliph, receives he wants the Caliph to support him so that he can claim legitimacy and that he can tell people this is our jihad against the Crusaders and hopefully take over or win back Jerusalem, which he did. And the Abbasid Caliph supported him, moral support, that's it. No armies, nothing. By the way, the Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph did control an army only for the city of Baghdad to defend the city itself. So he wasn't exactly a zero figurehead. Obviously, it depends who was in Baghdad at the time. So if there was a powerful ruler like the Seljuk rulers, he couldn't do anything. But when there was fragmentation even within that, then the Caliph could come in, at least exert some military power over the city of Baghdad itself. So we talked about two factors: the decline of the Caliphate in Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, so from the middle of 10th century all the way to 13th century. So that goes for about 3 centuries. And the fragmentation in the Muslim world meant that an external force could come in and put damage, inflict damage. And the Crusaders, although they weren't that big in terms of military force, they could come in and settle and cause lots of issues for Muslims for 200 years. Mongols are bigger. They can assemble bigger armies and they're more ferocious. So it was very hard to resist the Mongol forces. So that's the third factor. The third factor is the Mongol incursions in the Muslim world and the conquests. Interestingly, the Mongols were not interested in the Muslim world for a long time, and they were more interested in controlling Central Asian steppes or Asian steppes, Mongolia, parts of Central Asia, and China. Like Genghis Khan attacked China ferociously and wreaked a lot of damage. And interestingly, what happens to pull Mongols into the Muslim world is an incident involving the Khwarizmi Sultan at the time. There's a Mongol trade caravan or envoy, and for some reason they suspect them to be spies and kill them all. It's like touching or harming trade caravans is a big no-no at the time, because you just don't do it. Sometimes even in that medieval world, historians talk about two armies fighting, and these trade caravans are passing by them without worrying or what would happen to them. So it was a big no-no to touch traders, but Khawarizm Sultan did, unfortunately. So Genghis Khan sends an envoy, says, please explain, apologize, give some tributes or blood money, and then this will be over. But what does the Khawarizmi Sultan do? He kills the envoys. You just don't do that to Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan is furious. He stops his invasion of China halfway and decides to attack the Muslim world. So these diplomatic mistakes and perhaps arrogance and you got to be crazy or have wrong advice, whatever was the motive of the Khawarizm Sultan at the time, it really resulted in Mongols paying attention to the Muslim world and deciding to take it over. So starts the campaigns against the Muslim sultanates or governments in the area, starting with Central Asia, Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent. These cities are destroyed. Millions die. They say that historians put that the Mongols killed 10% of the world population. Just imagine that. So there's 8 billion people in the world right now. 10% of that is 800 million. 800 million, the population of India or something. Just imagine that's being decimated in a matter of a few decades. And that's exactly what happened. So these Muslim, big Muslim cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Tashkent, they were big populations. And though a lot of people, I guess, lived in this area, they were really well off. And which meant that the destruction was also great as well. So, but the Genghis Khan or the Mongols don't come to Baghdad straight away. It takes some decades to all come to Baghdad eventually. So why did Mongols decide to come to Baghdad or take it over? The historians say that the Mongols never intended to siege Baghdad or sack the city. They say the intention of the Mongol Khan, that was the Mongol Khan at the time. So Mongol Khan just wanted the Abbasid Caliphate to submit to him and to pay tribute, some sort of payment. He would be happy with that, or at least that what appears to be the diplomatic objective. But you don't raise a huge army just to achieve a diplomatic objective. And I personally think that Mongols did have the intention to take over Baghdad, because they raised an army. Hulagu, who is the grandson of Genghis Khan, he raised an army. 1 from every 10 fighting men has to join this expedition. So they're estimated to be around 150,000 people. The 150,000 army in 13th century is huge. We sometimes get these historical information, and it appears in Muslim history as well, like chronicles where Muslims are fighting Byzantines or something, and then the Muslims are 20,000 and the Byzantines are 200,000. This is the kind of numbers are given. This is impossible. Like 200,000, how to feed that army would be a major issue. Or you just didn't have men available at the time. So 20,000, 30,000 were the big armies. 40, 50,000 was really massive. 150,000 is huge. So they clearly, Mongols had an intention to do big damage in the Muslim world with that. So what they do, so Hulagu raises this army. He gets also a bit of a coalition force. He gets help from the Georgians. Georgians didn't like when Tiflis was, taken over and sacked by Abbasids. They wanted to take revenge of that. The Armenians also, as well as some of the remaining Crusader kings in Antioch. So they join Hulagu's army. But so Hulagu is passing by, coming down through Khorasan, Iran. What does he do? He wants to finish off an interesting side project. So one of his side projects of Hulagu is to get rid of the Ismaili assassins. Ismaili assassins wreaked havoc across the Muslim world. They were responsible for much of the political fragmentation. They just ended up killing people. They killed Nizam al-Mulk as well, and some of the Seljuk sultans that put the whole region into disarray. They tried to assassinate the Mongols. Well, you don't do that to the Mongols. So the Mongols had a grudge against the Ismailis. So the Ismailis they had this strategy of building these castles on top of the mountains. So the central headquarters was the Alamut, which is in the southern end of the Caspian Sea in modern-day Iran. So nobody could conquer this place. It was just too high, too hard to get. But Mongols lay siege to that Alamut and they destroy it, killing the spiritual head of the Ismaili assassins at the time. Ismailis does have different branches. So that particular branch that was known for assassinating prominent people basically was raised by Hulagu. So Hulagu, I guess, from one perspective, ended a chapter in the Muslim history. That's another interesting one. The rise and fall of the Ismaili assassins would be an interesting topic as well. So after that, the side project is completed. So Hulagu comes and lays siege to Baghdad. So Baghdad at the time, the Caliph is al-Mustasam, and he, what does he do? What does he do while Hulagu is marching? He's not worried. Very interesting. And a lot of historians, or even sort of Muslim sort of historians, they blame it on his Grand Vizier, Al-Alchemy. Al-Alchemy apparently advised him not to worry too much, that Hulagu or the Mongols are not going to dare attacking Baghdad itself. And even if they do, the Muslim world will rally to support the Caliph, because they're not going to allow Caliph to go down. What makes you say that? Like it's unbelievable. Well, even if Muslim world is there to help, it's fragmented anyway. It can't help. Look, the Caliph doesn't rally support. He doesn't ask for help. He doesn't even fortify the walls of the city. Very interesting case. Almost welcomes the army. So there's this overconfidence or underestimation of the Mongols' intentions, maybe massive assumptions about what Muslims will do at the time. So it's a big lesson, really. Like, if you want to defend yourself, or if you want to do anything, never assume that things will go the right way. So you just have to calculate risks and try to mitigate risks. Even now today, the corporate companies have this divisions or departments of risk management, because you never want to leave anything to chance. So Al-Alchemy gives that advice. So Caliph Hulagu first offers, so if you swear allegiance to the Mongol Khan and pay the tribute, we won't touch you. I mean, if he accepted that at the time, then one would assume it will be over. But basically, you're taking over or conquering Baghdad without bloodshed, and that's what would happen. And perhaps the Caliph would have stayed in some sort of ceremonial power. But he doesn't accept that, so a siege is held 12 days. And unfortunately, Caliph realizes that it's too late. He tries to sue peace. It's rejected at that time. And even there's about a group of 3,000 notables of the city. They say, well, let's go and speak to Hulagu, and maybe we can appeal for peace. So these 3,000 prominent people all go to Hulagu. What does Hulagu do? He kills them all. They're all killed. So basically, once Mongols decide to siege and destroy a city, they never go back on that. And that's been their reputation, and that's spread fear into all these other cities to then surrender, without fighting. So what follows is the destruction of the city and killing of the population. And I'm just going to read for you this wasaf, someone at the time, or who wrote about the destruction. He says in 1265, "They swept through the city like hungry falcons attacking a flight of doves, or like raging wolves attacking sheep, with loose reins and shameless faces, murdering and spreading terror. Beds and cushions made of gold and encrusted with jewels were cut to pieces with knives and torn to shreds. Those hiding behind the veils of the great harem were dragged through the streets and alleys, each of them becoming a plaything, and the population died at the hands of the invaders." So Caliph himself was killed. So Mongols had this interesting belief that the blood of a ruler or a king should not be spilled on the ground. It was bad omen. So what they did, they wrapped them around in a carpet and trampled the horses over him, unfortunately. So some people estimate the numbers of killed to be, the smallest estimate is 90,000 people to several hundred thousand. The Mongols themselves boasted years later to French king that they killed 2 million people in Baghdad. That's really impossible because there was just simply not enough population to warrant that. But it was a lot. Several, let's say 100,000 to several 100,000 people were killed. And they say that the river Tigris flew ink and blood for days. I guess that's a bit of a exaggeration. To probably blood and ink were visible in the river, and so it's sort of exaggerated to show the level of destruction, to describe that. So they destroyed House of Wisdom, Darul Hikmah, and so I'll come to that in terms of impacts. So the city was destroyed, the Mongols take over. So by the way, Hulagu is not only interested in Baghdad, he wants to take over the entire Middle East. So we'll come to that as well in terms of impact. So let me now talk about what has been the impact of the fall of Baghdad in 1258. So basically 4 main impacts we see. The first one is the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. It almost ended the entire institution of Caliphate. The Caliphate has moved to Egypt after that. Some of the descendants, Abbasid descendants, most of them were killed, but some of them escaped to Egypt, and they were kind of recognized as a caliph there, just making this ceremonial, let's have a caliph at least somewhere. And that was, they had absolutely no political or any power until 1517, when the Ottoman Sultan Selim conquered Egypt and then took the caliph title, and the caliphate was passed over to Ottomans, and the Ottomans then used that to some effect until it was abolished in 1924, when the Turkish Republic was established. So the caliphate, really the idea of caliph shifted dramatically. It ended an era. So caliphate before 1258 and after 1258 is really the biggest it's a defining moment in that respect. The second biggest impact of the 1250 fall of Baghdad was the transfer of leadership of the Muslim world from, let's say, the Arab origin, Arab leadership to Turkic leadership. That Turks have been involved in Middle Eastern warfare since early 8th century as soldiers, sometimes mercenaries, sometimes slave soldiers they're called. Over time they took over some of these territories, like, for example, at the time, 1258, when Hulagu came to Baghdad, in Egypt was ruled by Memluks. So Memluks were these Turkish slave soldiers who became later on the rulers themselves. So I mentioned Nuruddin. Nuruddin was Turkic as well, but they have they've never taken over fully. There was always that Abbasid or Caliphate at least. But after this 1258 fall of Baghdad, the political power shifted towards first Mongols and then the Turks. And we see this by the establishment, Ottoman or the state was established in 1299, just a few decades later in the outskirts of the Muslim world in Anatolia. And what we see after this is the Mughals in India, Safavids in Iran, or mainly centered in Iran, they were Turkic as well, and the Ottomans in the West. And then you've got these Khanates, in Central Asia, they were all also Turkic. So the power has shifted to the Turkish dynasties, and they became dominant in the Muslim world for the next 400 years. And so we see in 15th century onwards, sort of rise of Muslim world again. So there was this golden age with the Abbasid first, the first 100 years with the Umayyads, right regarded caliphs, 200 years with the Abbasids. So 300, 400 years, there was a massive rise in Islamic civilization. Then there's a decline with the Mongol invasion, the Crusades. Then there's a pandemic as well. So that goes for about 300-400 years. And then there's a rise again. So there's this 300-400 year cycles in the Muslim world. And we are now in another downturn in Muslim history, at least for the last 200 years. And then I haven't seen any signs of rising up, unfortunately. So that's the first big impact of the fall of Baghdad is decline or end of the Abbasid Caliphate. The second one is shift of political power to Turkish dynasties. And the third one is the cultural and intellectual decline in Baghdad or in Middle East in general. And the reason for that is Baghdad was the intellectual capital of the Muslim world at the time. As I mentioned, its city had up to 50 libraries, each library having 100,000 to 200,000 books. Huge. The Darul Hikmah, the House of Wisdom is there. So all of these are destroyed. And Baghdad never recovers. That part of the Middle East never recovers after that. Obviously, the intellectual rigor in the Muslim world did not die completely. One interesting fact is that Nasr ad-Din Tusi was in Hulagu's army. And he was a polymath and a major scholar. It is said that he actually stopped destruction of all the books. So he was able to recover really some important treasury of books and took it over with him to Maraga, and that resulted in this Maraga revolution, it's called. And Nasruddin Tusi was an astronomer himself. So in Central Asia, there's a resurgence of Islamic science and astronomy and so on. And also in Syria and in Egypt, also there's some continuation of intellectual activity at the time. But unfortunately, it never continues like it used to. And several centuries later, Europe starts to increase in science, economy, and starts taking over the Muslim world in civilization building. So the fall of Baghdad was a huge impact, negative impact on the intellectual aspect of the Islamic civilization. We never know what would happen in history, but if Baghdad did not fall, if those centers of learning remained, you never know. Muslim world may not have been decline intellectually as much. So number 4 impact is on the Mongols themselves. So when Baghdad was sieged and fell, and this destruction it sent tremors across the world at the time. And although it may look like Mongols conquered much of the world at the time, it actually started up a Mongol civil war. And the source of the war comes from Berke Khan. Berke Khan became Muslim in 1252. So he was in charge of Golden Horde, which was a big section of the Mongol Empire. At the time, Mongol Empire was split into 3. So he was ruling over one of them, the Golden Horde. And he was Muslim by 1258 for 6 years, and he was a devout Muslim. And so he said this when he heard about the fall of Baghdad. He said, he has sacked, meaning Hulagu, he has sacked all the cities of the Muslims and has brought about the death of the Caliph. With the help of God, I will call him to account for so much innocent blood. So Berke Khan was really angered. So what he does is that he allies himself with the Mamluks in Egypt. So basically he supports Mamluks. And eventually Hulagu's army is stopped at Ain Jalut. They receive a big defeat. And so probably Hulagu intended to go all the way to Egypt, take over Egypt. When you take Egypt, you take North Africa as well. So that would have completed the conquest of the entire Muslim world. But it was stopped by Berke Khan and also the Mamluks in Egypt. So that division in the Mongols meant that Islam started to now spread in the Mongol world, and they lost their political unity, or at least supporting of one another, the Mongol territories. And one thing that's really interesting is that whenever Mongols, took over a city, they killed any man who could fight, enslaved women and children, sometimes killed women and children as well. Like in Baghdad, they did that. But sometimes what they did, the only people who they spared was craftsmen. Craftsmen were valuable people. They had skills that you always need. So they enslaved these craftsmen, took it over with them to Mongol territories. And it is these craftsmen and traders as well are a big source. They were the source of Mongols converting to Islam as well. Because when you're a craftsman, you know how to deal with people, you know how to talk, please a customer, and you're skilled and respected. So that had an impact on Mongols. So Mongols did not come with a civilization. They were just this brute force that united, and they could rally that force on the populations. So they did not have a religion or a religious tradition in a sense that was superior to Islam. So that aspect, Islam or Muslim world was superior civilizationally, intellectually, culturally, and from a religious perspective. Islam was much more developed, and in books, and in systems, in laws. So basically, Islam ended up conquering the Mongols. So Islam has this tendency to conquer its own conquerors. And so Mongols became largely Muslim, or at least some parts of it, and they started to spread Islam into rest of Asia. So Fall of Baghdad in 1258 was a momentous event. It changed the world. It changed the Muslim world forever. And with that also influenced global history and geopolitics. And that, in a way, shaped the world in which we live in today. Thank you for listening.